All right, so we get to welcome back Congressman Reschenthaler from the 14th Congressional District. You are in DC, and there's so much going on right now.
Rose, there's so much going on. We're in the middle of a hearing in the Judiciary Committee. It's what we call a markup. So we're running a bill through the Judiciary Committee that's on policing.
Now, is that HR 7120? Is that the one you're talking about?
It is. And let me just clarify this. There's a House bill, which is frankly filled with a lot of bad ideas from the Democrats. And then there's a Senate bill, which is being championed and authored by my good friend from South Carolina, Senator Tim Scott. So what we have is we have these two competing bills. Tim Scott's can actually get done. And then, not to muddy the waters anymore, but yesterday, or earlier this week, I should say, President Trump just signed an executive order also focusing on policing.
Okay, so can I just ask you to qualify a few things just so the rest of us really understand it? So we've got this legislation in both houses. The one in the Senate, what happens if that passes? What happens after you discuss and it goes through? Do we still need to work on 7120 in the House of Representatives, or what do we do from there?
Sure. Well, let's just take each by turn real fast. So you have the executive order, which doesn't have the full weight of law. Basically, a president can have an executive order which just binds the executive branch. Now, rightly or wrongly, the executive branch in the federal government is huge and has a lot of power. But so it still has some weight, but it only pertains to the executive branch. Legislation, however, is much broader and stronger. So we have these two bills in the Senate and the House. If we pass in the House our House bill and the Senate passes Tim Scott's bill, we have the option of taking both bills into what's called a conference committee. And the conference committee is a committee, and they basically reconcile both bills, and they get the language exactly the same. And then that bill goes back to the Senate and the House to get passed, and then it becomes law. There's another option. The Senate could adopt the House bill, or the House can adopt the Senate bill and vote on that without going through conference. So I know this is really complicated, but Rose, in law school, they said real lawyers make all their money focusing on the procedure. And I feel like in Washington, D.C., although it is not glamorous, if you can control the procedure, if you can control the rules of the floor, you're in a position of power. So we might not be getting on Fox News and other media outlets talking about this, but this is really how the sausage gets made.
No, thank you for explaining that. I appreciate that, and I know that the people in your district do as well. One of the things that I would like to know, what is the meat of it? What do you especially like about what's in the Senate right now? Is there anything that's worth, your vote or consideration in the House of Representatives right now?
Well, yes, Rose. There's pros and cons of the House bill. There's actually a lot that we agree on. For example, we were just debating body cameras. I think it's really good to bring transparency into police departments. I also think the FBI, for example, should have to record their interrogations because we've seen that get abused, namely on actors from the president's team, right? I'm referencing General Flynn right now. Right. But we can bring greater transparency into law enforcement. That's certainly a good thing. So we can agree on that. What we don't agree on is we don't agree on taking away what's called qualified immunity for individual police officers. So what that is saying is that if the police officer is acting under the cloak of his office or in the role of a police officer, he cannot be held personally liable. The Democrats want to carve too much of that away, and what that would do is it would prevent police officers it would encourage them to retire or find other lines of employment, and it would discourage recruiting because no police officer wants to be subject to lawsuits that puts his or her savings, his or her house up for a lawsuit. So we can look at different aspects of qualified immunity. Maybe change the standard. There's room to negotiate there. But if you just want to strip away immunity from these officers, that's extremely problematic.
Honestly, Congressman, all of us want to see some sort of reform in terms of, knowing that those bad apples in the police force will be recognized, will be taken care of. At the same time, we want to protect all of the wonderful policemen that put on that uniform, and women, every single morning, not knowing what they're going to face, but going out there to protect us and our communities.
Yes, well, Rose, well said. And by the way, please, Rose, just call me Guy. But there's a lot that we can also agree on. And you mentioned it with training. We've got to take a look at the police officers and change the paradigm here, because the police are not the enemy. They're being portrayed as, frankly, bad actors. And there's a few bad actors, and they should face justice and full extent the law. And all four officers that were involved in George Floyd's death, they've been arrested and charged. Justice will be done. But to lump all the police in with just a few bad actors is wrong. These police officers are hardworking Americans. Look, I was a defense attorney. I was a prosecutor in the Navy. I was also a defense attorney in the Navy. I was a district judge for a period of time. I've worked with a lot of police, and they typically serve because they want to protect their community. They want to protect others. They basically want to make the world a better place. They should be. A lot of times there are heroes. So to treat them like this is really shameful. But let's just talk about training. With the understanding that most police are good actors, we should provide them training. We should give them de-escalation training. We should also give them additional training on how to deal with situations. Now, there's a lot of talks on chokeholds and banning this and banning that. We can talk about that, but the police officers cannot be left vulnerable. If they have a life or death situation and the only thing that's stopping them from getting hurt or injured or worse is a chokehold, then they need the ability to exercise that chokehold. So we've got to take a look at that, and we also need to do something to address the mental illness. Police officers are much more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty. They also have very high instances of depression, of PTSD, and I've already mentioned suicide. So we need to get them the resources to get the mental health they need and make sure it's done confidentially. The president's executive order touches upon this, and Senator Scott has some provisions in his bill as well. The Democrat bill, however, sorely lacks this. The Democrat bill is focused really on being punitive on the police, and what it would do is it would encourage police officers to stay in their car. We don't want police officers in the proverbial car. We want them in the community. And so we, in the Republican Party, are taking a look on encouraging community policing. And if you want, Rose, I can talk about community policing, but there's a lot of reasons why we want police interacting with the community, because at the end of the day, when you have police engaged, crime rates are reduced. When you have police staying in their cars and not policing, either through putting too much restrictions on them or defunding them, which a lot of Democrats want to do, that the perverse incentive is that crime rates go up because police aren't policing.
I know that when you bring up community policing, and I do want to talk about it because I know that in Boston, for example, that is something that they've been doing. Now, you hear good and bad, and maybe they're just not doing it as best they can. Some have said the effectiveness was ambiguous, but at the same time, I can't help but think that there are good things to community policing, because when I think about even schools, some of the high schools now have a police officer working in the school, and the children get to know him. And I really feel like that connection, with those you're protecting and those who are being protected, there's a connection there, and I think it makes a difference.
It does make a difference, Rose. When I was a district judge, I saddled two school districts. I had, for those of you in Pittsburgh, I straddled Thomas Jefferson, which I'm an alumni of, in South Park. And I can tell you that in the schools that had the school resource officer, namely South Park and Pleasant Hills Middle School, we saw instances that were reduced. So we had behavioral issues were on the decline. You also had, I think, drug use instances were declined. And those students got the benefit of interacting with those police every single day. And the police were out there, they were talking to kids, bullying instances went down. And if there was a disruption in school, the school resource officer came and helped to pacify it, and also helped me as a district judge make sure that when I had an order that the kids had to do this or that or study, he was there to help maintain that. In the one school that refused to let the school resource officer in, we had a lot more behavioral issues. And I think anecdotally, we had more drug use, unfortunately, in that school. And also those kids were not acclimated to the police officers. They were not used to having police officers around. And so they were alienated from law enforcement. So that there's a lot to be said for that. But we also should have school resource officers in our schools, not only for the community policing, but frankly, just to protect the schools. So I'm all for having community policing, and it starts with school resource officers.
That's interesting. So what is the process exactly though, since we do think that this is possibly a good idea? What's the process? Where do you go from here? Just thinking it's a good idea.
Right. So, well, we're going to have to see what kind of bill the Democrats put forth this week in the Judiciary Committee. And Republicans are fighting tooth and nail to simultaneously strengthen that bill. We've been fighting for a lot of good amendments on that bill. And we're also fighting to strike the bad elements from that bill. Because what we want as Republicans is we want a bill that's coming out of Judiciary Committee that's as close to Senator Tim Scott's bill as possible. So that's what we're doing. But once this product is finished, and I'm cautiously optimistic we're going to have a bill, I think that resembles more of Tim Scott's bill, not that radical left's bill. But I want to take that bill, and that bill will tie funding, federal funding, to police departments if they engage in community policing, if they require police to wear body cameras, if they prevent what we would call the spoliation or destruction of evidence. So if they take this, and if they have money for, if they have opportunities for mental health care and other resources, if they engage in community policing, the list goes on and on. But if they do those things, then they get federal funding. If they refuse to update and modernize, they don't get the federal funding. So we're looking at a sticks and carrots approach, which I think I can get behind, because Rose, we don't want to federalize the police. What we do want to do, though, is say that if you, local police department or state police department, if you get federal fundings, you've got to do X, Y, and Z.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. How do the Democrats feel about community policing?
Well, it's interesting because they talk a lot about community policing, but Barack Obama and then President or Vice President Joe Biden had 8 years to do something about community policing. They did absolutely zero, just like they did about criminal justice reform. It was President Trump that got done criminal justice reform. And it's President Trump that just had the executive order, and it's President Trump who's leading to get police reforms done and encouraging community policing. Just as an aside, earlier this week, I was very fortunate to go to the White House, and I was in the Rose Garden when President Trump was announcing the executive order. That was followed up by a meeting with President Trump's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, and then we went into the Oval Office. It was myself, Tim Scott, Jim Jordan, and a few others. The bottom line is the president is leading on this. He's working with leaders in the House, namely Jim Jordan and others on the Judiciary Committee. And then in the Senate, he's working very closely with my good friend, Senator Tim Scott. So President Trump is leading. Joe Biden and Barack Obama squandered 8 years when they could have actually done something to address this problem. Unfortunately, they did not. We have this mess now. But again, thankfully, Republicans in D.C. and President Trump will fix these problems.
I agree. Okay, so thanks for giving us an update. I really appreciate that. Continue to let us know what's going on and keep up the good work. Thank you, Congressman Reschenthaler.
Rose, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.